Hello, very good to see you all. Is my mic on? Not yet. Let me make it go on. Good evening. It's a pleasure to see you all. I'm Paola Antonelli. I'm a director of R&D here at MoMA. Also, I'm a senior curator of architecture and design. And I haven't seen you, some of you I haven't seen in almost a year, because that's the last time that we had a salon here. It was a salon about fluidity. Then I took a hiatus. I was on sabbatical. I did a salon at Harvard about hybridity, and then I've been really missing you, and now I'm back. And I'm so happy that this salon happens tonight, because we've so had enough with anything that concerns the elections tomorrow. So this salon is for us all. This salon is for us all to think of what happens beyond tomorrow, beyond all the white noise and all the yellow and green noise that we've heard in these past few months, or it seems that it's been years. So the salon tonight is about the future, but not any future. It's about an informed future. It's about a future that is based on not only what we know, but also what we want. It's an optimistic salon, and it's a salon where we'll discuss what we can not only expect, but also build into the future. And as you know, the R&D department at MoMA was born with this idea to help the future that we are building. You know, museums are these temples that very often discuss the past, maybe the present, but they're not really considered by many workshops and labs for the future. And instead, more and more, so many of my colleagues and so many of my colleague institutions are trying to actually take an active role and see what they can contribute to help people and citizens build their own future. So tonight's salon is in that spirit, and the whole R&D department is in that spirit. What we do is we meet maybe once every other month, and we pick a topic that is relevant to the outside world, that is not just within the ivory tower, within the art bubble, but is instead really important for society. And we try to offer something that the museum can contribute. So talking about the future, what future can be foretold or built both by scientists, by experts, and also by artists and by citizens, is what we'll be doing tonight. And you know, Alvin Toffler, who wrote Future Shock, probably he was the first futurist, or the one that really crystallized and made this kind of practice famous, wrote that change is the process by which the future invades our lives, in his characteristic florid prose that made so many of his contemporary critics think that he was not such a good writer after all. But he wrote all these bestsellers, and he remains like the kind of the narrator of the future for us all in our mind. You know, in the informed future means having some basis to predict it, but for a very long time we've let the gods or nature or a few interpreters and middle people in between the gods and us predict this future, and we still do that. I mean, you can go back to ancient times and to Greece with the Temple of Pythia, where the oracle would foretell the future. And to this day, in Tibet, the oracle, the Nichon, tells the Dalai Lama what the future will be. And with many different degrees in between, so many heads of state still rely on this kind of pseudoscience, so much so that there are protests that are happening right now in South Korea, because the people of South Korea are outraged because their president apparently relies on one such they consider charlatan to help her in the decisions that she needs to make. But you know, there are so many different forecasting methods that we try to base on science, but we never know if it's real science or if it's instead only pseudoscience. Pseudoscience is tarot reading, it's like cartomantics, it's like reading your hands, and you see there's this beautiful fortune teller by Caravaggio. They're all kind of grouped together, these kind of methods under the term pseudoscience. But palmistry, astrology, tarot reading go back in the centuries, and are sometimes based on some readings of nature that could be based on some information. Then there are very different perspectives on the future and on an informed future that come from all these different realms. In physics, we're giving you just some examples. Of course, it's not like the whole breadth of possibilities, but special relativity makes it so that the future is in the eye of the beholder in a way, because the faster a person is moving away from a moving object, the slower the object seems to move. So it's about a sense of time that is not as absolute anymore. Or in philosophy, presentism is the opposite of eternalism, and they both are the opposite, as happens in philosophy, of growing block view. So it's about believing that only the present exists, or that only the past and the present exists, or that everything exists at the same time. So you see there are so many different ways to think also of the self in the towards future. Like in psychology, the end of history illusion talks about the fact that we always think about the future as if we never changed as human beings, but in truth, we are moving targets as much as the future is a moving target. And we will never ever be able to really grasp the future because we are going to be part of that evolution. When it comes to religion, well, there are so many different ways and so many different flavors of future depending on the religion that you abide by that I don't even want to begin. I just come back from a trip to India and Bangladesh where I was doing research for the items exhibition for next year about garments, so maybe karma is the one that I feel closer to me today. But eschatology and the afterlife or none of the above is also part of the same discussion. And there we get to art and design and literature, maybe some of the most comfortable ways to read the future in this room. And we can talk about, when it comes to design, speculative design and futurism. When it comes to literature, the science fiction and fantastic realism. And also, and tonight we'll talk about it more, the different specific ways to read the future that belong in specific communities like Afrofuturism and Asia Futurism. Is Don here by any chance? Don Chan? Yeah, you're here. So we have Ytasha for Afrofuturism and we have Don for Asia Futurism, which is great. But when it comes to truly informed ways, scientific ways to read the future, maybe the most well-known theories are chaos theory, in particular the work of Edward Loren, who was also the famous formulator of the butterfly effect. And it says so that future is based on the idea that chaos is when the present determines the future, but the approximate present does not approximately determine the future. And that was a happenstance formulation, a finding that he made when he picked up an experiment halfway and he noticed that the result was completely different just because of the different context. So Edward Loren formulated this effect, the butterfly effect, which is what made him very famous. And we all have come to know it as the fact that a very small action can have an immediate and resounding reaction in the future and can change the destinies of the world. Another theory that is quite well known is Karl Popper's falsifiability and verifiability theory. And what is really interesting about it is that it's about opening up to criticism and to confutation. So Popper's idea is that it is easy to obtain confirmations or verifications for nearly every theory if we look for confirmation. So we can pretty much make any kind of hypothesis and we'll find a way to confirm that hypothesis. But confirmations should count only if they are the result of risky predictions. A theory which is not refutable by any conceivable event is non-scientific. Irrefutability is not a virtue of a theory, as people often think, but a vice. Every genuine test of a theory is an attempt to falsify it or refute it. In other words, go out on a limb and try to confirm your beliefs until somebody else will refute them. And in that case, the whole world will know they're true. It's kind of a convoluted but really interesting idea. Karl Popper became then known for other reasons. He was the basis for instance, Thatcherism. So in a way, his legacy is not as crystal clear. But in this particular openness to trial, to test of theories, is what we read about the future according to him. Of course, another well-known theory is Nassim Taleb's Black Swan. And Nassim Taleb was not the first one to talk about black swans. We go back to Latin times. It was the poet Juvenal that first talked about black swans as being the exceptions that change completely any idea that we might have about a specific field. And in that case, it was the fact that swans were all white. Well, the Black Swan event is an event that is completely a surprise, that has really gigantic impact, and that we try to rationalize in hindsight. And what is really interesting is that there are so many of these events that they're almost a normalcy. And the Black Swan book is about an attempt to strengthen society in order to enable it to withstand such events. So it's interesting because it's almost a preventative book. It's not about talking about the existence of these events. These have existed for all of our history. It's about getting ready for them. And interestingly, this book was particularly co-opted by the financial system. Today I was looking at people who really quoted and studied this book, and it turns out that it's the financial sector, almost as if they were trying to find a way to assuage their guilt, in particular for 2008 and the financial crisis, very interestingly so. So in hindsight, we can fix everything. So right now, we're in the middle of this amazing white noise, deafening white noise for the elections. And we are trying desperately to go beyond it and to find some foundation, some information, some data. And I'm not talking about polls. I'm talking about basic human beliefs to understand what's going on and to try and figure out what will happen next. And, you know, there's so many people that we can talk to, and there are many different peoples that can help us understand the future. And I wanted to have a few here in this slide. So there are the trend forecasters, and I'm putting here some friends and some people that I don't know yet, but I would like to know. So one is Sharon Lee. You see her on the upper left corner. She's a wonderful, not even trend forecaster, but she's really an instigator. She's been looking at teens for the past 20 years. So she's been looking at generations of teens coming one after the other. In the middle, next is Lee Edelcourt. Some of you might know her. She is very active in the world of design and in fashion. And she has been working in fashion for many years, but also put out a wonderful magazine that was called Colors, not Colors, what am I talking about? It was called Bloom. It was about flowers. Colors is another one. And right now she's also teaching at Parsons. I think she's running a department. I'm always bad with titles, but Tim, you can explain it afterwards if you want to. But she's really very good at understanding the world of design and the world of fashion. Next is a diagram from Kay Hole's report that introduced the term normcore. So Kay Hole, that now kind of disbanded, was a small guerrilla group in New York City that was observing and kind of inferring new trends in society. And the idea of normcore, I'm sure, how many of you know normcore? Okay, good. This audience, right? But, so, they're pretty good at understanding what comes just next. And then last but not least is Omoyemi Akerele, that's based in Lagos, that's doing the same thing, especially translating the new trends in Africa for the Western world. You could say the trend forecasters have launched their forecasts about 1 or 2 years in advance, not that much. It's about in a way, alerting the industry and helping consulting for companies that will need to deal with consumers. They still call them consumers, like we call them citizens, but they're dealing with a pretty short-term future. Then we have the long-term future visionaries. So I'm showing you there up top right, Danny Hillis and Stuart Brand, who together founded the Long Now Foundation. They're two fantastic human beings. And you might know that Stuart Brand was also the founder of the Good Earth Catalog. And the Long Now Foundation is about thousands of years from now. It's about thinking slow and long term. And then we have the visionaries like Steve Jobs that don't really forecast the future, but rather arrogantly make it and don't really wait for somebody to tell them what's going to happen. I know it's a platitude, but it's the truth. You know, there are some people that just act that way. You have then the science fiction writers that pretend they're writing fiction, but in reality, they're already kind of telling you what's going to happen, and then what they say actually happens. And you see there Margaret Atwood, the great Octavia Butler, and late Octavia Butler, and William Gibson. And then last but not least, the futurists like Faith Popcorn and Paul Sappho, that are the ones that maybe are closest in some cases to the pseudoscience of yesteryear, and that are in some other cases instead much closer to being trend forecasters, but also buttressed by scientific studies and data. So it's interesting to see how many different categories exist. But I was telling you about the sci-fi writers. Well, I don't have to tell you about Méliès and the Voyage dans la Lune, which was 1908, and the fact that the voyage to the moon actually happened. Or, of course, 2001, A Space Odyssey, and all sorts of tablets and iPads, and Back to the Future and virtual reality. And you can go on forever with examples. There's this beautiful outline of the predictions in fiction that became real that actually is the work of Giorgia here. It's impossible to look at in this particular slide, but if you Google on brain pickings and you Google brain pickings Giorgia Lupi, you can go and look at it and really dive through. It's a wonderful outline of fictionary predictions that became true. And here's some more literature looking backwards. 1888, Edward Bellamy, it predicted credit cards. The World Set Free predicted the atomic bomb, H.G. Wells. And of course, Neuromancer, Neuromancer, Neuromancer. How many times have we quoted it? It predicted the World Wide Web. So it really is, it's kind of, we can be confident, we can trust artists to have a sense of the future that can really compare and can give a good time and a good rivalry also to futurists and trend forecasters. And you see here Walter Pickler and his TV helmet of 1967, and some artists of today with a field design group in 2015 and the Oculus in between. So artists are always helping us, and designers especially, are always helping us deal with change. You know, I like to say that designers exist to help people deal with change, that they take revolutions in science and technology and make them into objects that all of us can use, therefore allowing us to metabolize progress and to make it happen. Going in history, just a few designers that were all about the future. Well, Bucky Fuller, of course, many architects. You know, you see here just a few architects. One of the great Japanese metabolists of the 1960s, Kiyonori Kikutake. Then the famous Archigram Walking City. Oh, wait, I have a laser beam. Yay. So Archigram, the Walking City, and Super Studios, Life Without Objects in 1969. And of course, Le Corbusier and the La Ville Radieuse in 1924. And you can see how so much of the world is built that way. And in a way, Le Corbusier was like Steve Jobs. He just like built the future the way he saw it. Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum has published this report that was the fruit of a collaboration with hundreds of different experts that kind of hover around the World Economic Forum about the fourth industrial revolution, which is a revolution that sees a new platform that puts together the digital space, the physical space, and biology. So it's about changes that happen that cannot anymore be attributed to any particular part of our being or of our environment. So integral and organic they are. And that's what so many artists are helping us with movies, with sci-fi, with speculative work, also with demonstrations of this kind. I really love the work of Hiroshi Ishiguro. He's a scientist in Osaka, and he studies the relationship between human beings and machines. So what you see here is Matsuko Deluxe, who is a Japanese television anchor, a gay man, cross-dresser, matronly, favors this particular style of muumuus with like big jewelry, and the humanoid that replicates Matsuko exactly, and they have a TV show together. So one of them is the humanoid, the other one is the person. I find this really beautiful because it really brings you to think about what it is that you can put into a machine. I was telling you about speculation. You know, speculative design is extremely important. Of course, it's my area of interest, so I know it maybe better than other areas, but I have to say that the distinction that speculative designers, especially Tony Dunn and Fiona Raby. Tony and Fiona, are you here? No, not yet, but they're supposed to come later. But they have kind of established this particular practice in the past 15 years. And this is a diagram that was designed by Stuart Candy, who's a future studies expert that's based in Canada. So you see, there's the present, and then there's all these different futures. There's the possible future, which is the one that's about to happen. There's the plausible future, which is the one where most designers work. So they take what is already available and they build this future. But then there's a probable and preferable future, and that's where speculative designers work. They try to steer the future in that direction. They try to steer design in that direction. They're not as arrogant and totalitarian as Steve Jobs or Le Corbusier, but they have a little bit of gumption, and they try to push things in the right angle and in the right direction. And you see here, this is an homage also to Amy, because Amy puts out these newsletters that are the future of, and the most recent was the future of companion robots. And so I wanted to quote here Dunn and Raby, this series of robots that is in the MoMA collection from 2007. It hypothesizes a future in which robots, companion robots, are not so servile and nice like Rosie and the Jetsons, but they are neurotic and they need to be taken care of and convinced before they start taking care of you. So one needs to be taken in the arms and cuddled, the other one trembles when there's a magnetic field. So it's all about having a different relationship with them. On the other hand, there is some design that is based on plausible future. There is some design that responds to needs that are present and real that can help us steer the future in a different direction. For instance, this particular data visualization by Spatial Information Design Lab at Columbia University, I use it all the time as a great example. This visualization gives you a sense of reality. So it's about the past and the present, but it can be amazing and incisive in building a future. It tells you how much money the government spends for certain blocks in inner cities in the United States to keep some of the inhabitants of that block either in prison or in halfway houses. So it tells you that there are more than 300 of these blocks in Brooklyn alone. And it tells you that by not simply giving you figures that can leave you outraged for 20 minutes, but then they leave you indifferent. It gives you this kind of blood red splotches onto a black map of Brooklyn. And these splotches will stay with you. They will engrave themselves in your mind with their elegance and their strength. And they will make it so that you will change the way you see the future, that you will think that there must be alternatives possible. And indeed, the actual limits of what is achievable depend in part on the beliefs people hold about what sorts of alternatives are viable. And this is a thought that I would like to leave with you for tomorrow, you know, to get you through tomorrow. And tonight, to talk about what our perception of the possibilities are, we have 4 outstanding human beings that I love so much and that have 4 different takes on the future. We're going to start in order of appearance with Amy Webb from Webb Media. And you already have all of your bios in your folder, so I'm not going to recite the bio. But Amy has been putting out these great newsletters that are the future of, that come out every month, more or less, that are so interesting because she gathers under a particular umbrella. Here you are. I just quoted you. I'm glad you're here. Under a particular umbrella, she gathers the future of something in particular. So they're really quite interesting. After Amy, we'll have Ytasha Womack. Ytasha is a filmmaker, an artist, an author, and she's an expert in Afrofuturism. So she is able to explain a possible future from a particular angle that is very incisive and very influential today. After Ytasha, we'll have Giorgia. Giorgia Lupi is a visualization designer. So in a way, she is, if we look at the philosophical and psychological ways to look at the future, she's a presentist in that she looks at the past and the present, and she always deals with the past and the present because she looks usually at data that are about the past and the present. But by doing so, she also infers the future in a way that is clear and quite powerful. And last but not least, we have Ari Wallach. Ari is a great futurist that works a lot with governments and with NGOs. And I have to say it because I was so impressed when I found out it was him. I admired the program before knowing it was him, but he was the author of The Great Schlep. You might remember The Great Schlep from which election was it?
2008.
2008, remember? Yeah, about convincing your grandparents in Florida to vote Democrats. So we'll have them here tonight. And by the way, we're live streaming tonight, just so you know. And we also added a hashtag to our offering. So if you don't mind using as a hashtag MoMA Salon, that would be great. So I would like to welcome here first Amy Webb.
I will, but I'll be very, very fast.
You're smooth in plugging yourself in. Great.
So 3 quick things about me before I get going. So my name is Amy Webb, and I'm a futurist who focuses on the intersection of technology, business, government, and society. I'm the CEO and founder of the Future Today Institute, and we work with Fortune 500 companies and Global 1000 companies. We do a lot with the State Department. We advise all kinds of organizations all around the world. I'm also an adjunct professor of futurism, which sounds weird, like a weird made-up title. It is. I teach at the Stern School of Business, where I'm teaching business school students about how to forecast the future. And I'm the author of The Signals Are Talking, Why Today's Fringe is Tomorrow's Mainstream. And that comes out in a couple of weeks, and it's all about what the tools of a futurist are and how to use them. But that's enough about me. I'd like to tell you a true story. It's a true crime story. And a media executive, I get pitched all the time, but a media executive recently pitched me a new strategy for what he thinks is the future of news. And this is what our conversation looked like. The executive said, we're going to be the Uber for news. Me, I was confused. The executive said, 3 years from now, we'll have an on-demand news platform for millennials. They're going to tap a button on their phones, and they'll get the news delivered to them wherever they are right away. This is the future of news. Me, is it an app? The executive, maybe. The point is that you get the news right away, when you want it, wherever you are. Me, so you mean an app? The executive, yes, but more like Uber. Now, there were 2 crimes committed that day. The first one, and this happens all the time, is that the executive mistook what is a thriving platform for an Uber for X tech trend. And that is because he was caught up in what I call the paradox of the present. And this happens when we are confronted with new technology. We can't see beyond what we currently know to be true because of our reptilian brains. Our lizard brains take over, and we are either completely paralyzed and afraid of whatever that new technology is, or we assume that the entire world is passing us by, and so we adopt it without asking any questions. And the thing is that you have to follow tech trends, and that is because they're signposts that can be tracked as technology moves from the fringe to the mainstream. And the reality is that real trends that you should pay attention to usually aren't very trendy. In fact, they're usually pretty boring. So what is a real trend? What are the things worth paying attention to? It's driven by a basic human need, one that is catalyzed by new technology. It's timely, but it persists. A trend evolves as it emerges, and a trend can materialize as a series of unconnectable dots, weird experiments and things that are happening out on the fringe that eventually move to the mainstream. Now, the second crime that was committed was that because the executive was so blinded by Uber, by Uber's success, that he wanted to copy it. And because he was so distracted, he missed the real trend that was worth watching. And that is that Uber's platform is a threat to traditional media organizations. So I'm going to break it down for you. This is a lot of text. But today, in the year 2016, Uber is a well-capitalized ride-sharing service that you can use in New York City that's offered around the world. In the next year or two, Uber will be a well-capitalized fleet of self-driving taxis that offer service around the world, partnering with companies like Google. Not too long after that, Uber is a well-capitalized on-demand logistics service, not unlike UPS, that will drive you and your family and your pets and your stuff and make deliveries wherever it needs to go. Not too long after that, Uber becomes a car service that you no longer have to maintain, you don't have to lease, you don't even have to think about. Uber simply moves you and your stuff from point A to point B. Uber then becomes, because we are in these cars where we don't have to worry or pay attention to what we're doing anymore, Uber is going to free us up in the future to do anything that we want. We can exercise while we're in the car. We can eat. Probably the design of cars themselves will look nothing like they do today because we won't have to have those seat configurations. Now, my question to you is, what is the one media source, and even as New Yorkers, you know the answer to this, what's the one media source that we use in our cars? That's right. Uber kills radio. Uber and driverless cars are going to free our attention from captivity. And at that point, I don't care how great the podcast is. I don't care how great the television show is. And I am an ardent supporter of NPR. But are you going to still choose to sit idle and listen to the radio while doing nothing else? And this is an analogy for the challenge that we all face and the reason that futurists exist. We have to simultaneously think about today, tomorrow, and many, many years from now without getting distracted by shiny objects. The future of any organization, of any political movement, of any social group, any business depends on your ability to see what's happening out on the fringe and to track that as that moves to the mainstream. And that's my job. It's to figure out what's the future of X using data and modeling and creative thinking and mixing all of that together and getting an answer. Now, there's no degree in futurism, but futurism as an academic discipline goes back a very, very, very long time. It's an interdisciplinary field going back more than 100 years. And for those of us who do this professionally, we tend to sort of sit in this weird intersection of the hard sciences, and also economics and game theory, but also things like design and statistics and mathematics and other specialized fields. Now, real futurists don't make predictions. And that's because a prediction would make us think that the answer is knowable. And the answer is not knowable, and that's because at any given time there could be lots of different shifts in what's happening and what we're doing and what we're thinking. So this is how I approach my work, and every futurist has a similar kind of model. Mine has 6 steps. I start out on the fringe, I gather a bunch of data, I collect that data, I do pattern recognition, I do modeling from the pattern recognition, and so forth and so on. And it's a pretty arduous process, but by the end of it, I've gotten very, very good at understanding what's likely to be over the horizon and what we should be paying attention to. And that's why I get really concerned when I see headlines like this, and unfortunately, I see them all the time, right? Here's a bunch of predictions for artificial intelligence in the year 2016. Now, if you think about the future of AI, we tend to think in one of 2 ways. AI is going to take all of our jobs and make humans completely obsolete, or AI is going to become weaponized and kill us all, right? Those are pretty much the two conversations that we hear, and if you start poking around online, that's pretty much all that you're going to find. And the challenge is that this perpetuates our belief bias, right? So this is what we're used to hearing, so we start to assume that this is what, what's going to happen and what comes true. But the real future of AI is not that simple. In the 1600s, artificial intelligence was first imagined, and there are lots of texts written about imagining the day that a machine might be able to think just like a person. In the 1880s, the idea of a machine that could think was first postulated by Ada Lovelace in the footnotes of a paper that she was translating from Italian. In the 1960s, AI was first codified as an academic discipline. In the 80s, we finally had enough compute power to do something with those theories. In the 2000s, there were finally enough people to do research in the field. In the 2010s, we finally had enough money to scale. And this is why it's important to you. By the year 2021, AI will finally be pervasive. It will be part of everything that we do. Now, you probably saw this story about a cat in the New York Times, right? In the New York Times, YouTube had a whole bunch of computers watching videos all day long. And at the end of this big grand experiment, the computers were on their own able to identify a cat, right? And some people sort of laughed at this story, but it was a really important moment at the end of this very long history. We've built artificial neural networks, and essentially these are systems of computers that are trained by showing them millions and millions of photos from a basic corpus. And over time, that network parameters get adjusted until the classifications are correct. We're trying to build computers that can think, right? Futuristic computers that can think. And we are modeling them off of what we know about our own brains. And these early computer systems are learning just by doing just like we are. So this is Google's DeepMind system. And essentially, it showed the computers a bunch of photos of clouds and said, imagine. Just like as a toddler, you probably went outside and looked at the clouds and imagined things. This is what Google saw. In the clouds, Google saw Admiral Dog, the pig snail, the camel bird, the dogfish. It saw these images and automatically named them, automatically tagged them. And it did the same thing over and over and over again. From this horizon, it saw towers and pagodas. From trees, it saw buildings. From leaves, it saw birds and insects. This training is helping machines to learn to act and to think more like humans. Now, while all of us have been busy committing crime number 2, which again is we're not paying attention to the real trend, the real technology, this happened. So does anybody remember Tay.ai? So for those of you who weren't on the interwebs that day, Microsoft has been experimenting with AI, and it built a chatbot a couple years ago and released it in China. That chatbot's name is Xiaoi's. And that chatbot did really, really interesting things. It lived on social networks. Once you started communicating with it, it remembered you. If you texted it a photo of your broken ankle, the next time you logged on, it was a she. She would ask you how you were feeling. She would remind you to take care of yourself. And so when they released that exact same system here in the United States on Twitter, I think the expectation was, well, we'll have the same result. But of course, this is the United States. This is not China, but we have a free and open internet. At the beginning, it was okay. This artificially intelligent bot said things like, here's a question, humans. Why isn't hashtag National Puppy Day every day? Tay, you are a stupid machine. Well, I learned from the best. If you don't understand that, let me spell it out for you. I learned from you, and you are dumb too. And then things took a turn for the worse. Did the Holocaust happen? It was made up. Clapping emoji. Hitler was right. I hate the Jews. Now, this isn't somebody sitting at the computer typing, right? This is a machine that's been trained to think like us people, like us humans, and it was generating this content on its own. Like this. This is an image that it generated. Swagger alert, since before internet was even a thing. It went out, found a picture of Hitler, filtered it, wrote swag alert, and put a neon circle around it. Hitler did nothing wrong. gas the kikes, race war now. On and on and on. It took less than 8 hours for Tay to become a racist, homophobic, bigoted, anti-Semitic chatbot. Now, there are other instances of AI behaving badly too. So this is Google, and the same Google system that's being trained to see interesting things in the cloud miscategorized these people as gorillas. Now, to Google's credit, they immediately apologized, but they couldn't just correct it. They had to take the entire system offline. And if you want to have a somewhat depressing few minutes, Google CEO on Google Images. Does anybody know the first instance of a woman to show up, who that person is? I'll answer that question for you. It's CEO Barbie. And if you want to find a person of color, forget it. You'll be scrolling for a while. These machines have parents. They're programmers. And they have textbooks. That's our data. We are their mothers and fathers. We are creating the future of AI in our own image. Within a decade, we're going to realize that we've taught machines how to talk, and that they've learned from our structural racism, our sexism, our homophobia, our xenophobia. Because the future of AI isn't AI is going to take all of our jobs and AI is weaponizing itself. It's much more complicated than that, and that's why futurists matter. We have this basic computer infrastructure, which we don't even think about anymore. We have the internet and networks of computers that we only think about when they go down. But very, very soon, AI will be pervasive. It will be invisible, and it will be a part of everything that we do. And we are training these systems in the present tense, and we should probably be thinking about the implications of that. Now, as a futurist, I'm not somebody who looks into my crystal ball to sort of think about what all of this might mean. I use data, and I study this stuff rigorously, and I model it out. And I believe that we have an opportunity for a better future. We don't have to succumb to racist AI chatbots ruling our lives, but we do have to start asking difficult questions, and we can't just assume that the headlines that we're seeing about technology, in this case AI, but honestly it's about every technology, self-driving cars, CRISPR, biohacking, all of these different things. You have the opportunity, and I would argue you should be asking difficult questions. We all need to start developing scenarios, making adjustments, and do the work of actual future forecasting. That's because the future isn't something that happens to us passively. It's something that we create together in the present. And so what I'd like to leave you with is that I would like for all of you, starting tomorrow, to use the tools that I have as a futurist. And so what I've done is I've created a Dropbox folder with everything in it that you could possibly imagine. So all the stories that I've just shown you, plus a whole bunch of different tools. The more that we all start acting like futurists, not pontificating and fetishizing the future, but instead doing the real work of thinking critically about what's coming next, the more that you all do what I do, the better off our world will be. Thank you.
So the clicker is on the podium. Okay. If you need it. Go.
Hi, how are you? My name is Ytasha Womack. I have the pleasure of being the author of this book, Afrofuturism, The World of Black Sci-Fi and Fantasy Culture, and it actually sent me on a journey. And that journey was really a journey that took me deeper within myself to connect with concepts that I hadn't really put together as one before. And I soon discovered that I was an Afrofuturist and didn't realize I was an Afrofuturist. And my thought is that you're probably an Afrofuturist in many respects as well. What is Afrofuturism exactly? Afrofuturism is really, this is interesting, the way it popped up here. Okay, so Afrofuturism is a way of looking at the future, but referencing black culture, using a black cultural lens. It is an intersection between the imagination, it is an intersection between the imagination, an intersection between Black culture, technology. It is a way of integrating mysticism and essentially helping people to reevaluate themselves, but also to connect with certain kind of artistic aesthetic. As an artistic aesthetic, it integrates music, literature, visual arts, film, dance. It is a tool for self-healing and liberation. It helps to use the imagination to transcend circumstances, because ultimately, to imagine oneself into the future facilitates agency. And this is particularly significant in one respect for people of African descent, because I'm assuming many of you may be science fiction fans, it wasn't always common to have people of African descent in the future, and particularly taking or expressing certain levels of agency in those futures. And what that does is it starts to undermine the imagination. It starts to facilitate situations where people don't necessarily feel that they can have a role in the future or that they are supposed to be a part of that future. But on the other side, whether you identify as being a part of that culture or not, there are subconscious messages that are being communicated with respect to how you can shape a future and what you can reference, what's relevant and what's not, who has agency, who does not. And these are really kind of self-reflective spaces that Afrofuturism, just through starting just with the representational aspect of it, helps people to think about, maybe I haven't seen people of African descent in the future in an image, and why is that? So there are a lot of examples of Afrofuturism throughout our artistic lineage. There is Sun Ra. How many Sun Ra fans do I have here in the audience? Okay, fantastic. So Sun Ra is a jazz musician who came out of Birmingham and very much believed that he came to Earth from Saturn to help facilitate and help people to, he wanted to heal the earth using music. He felt that music could help facilitate teleportation. He felt that the vibrations from music could transform the world. He was as much a musician as he was a philosopher. But one of the things that's perhaps most interesting about Sun Ra is the fact that he was wrestling with his own sense of alienation. And so to imagine himself as a person from another world helped him to not only create another kind of musical aesthetic, but it helped him to understand his relationship with the very planet that he was on, where he did not feel like he was welcome. And it also helped to underscore a sense of having a larger sense of purpose for him. So whether people want to say, well, this was a mythology that he believed because it was kind of interesting musically, I mean, that's one take. But on the other hand, it was also a way to help him reconcile with who he was and some of the challenges with respect to culture and race that he was socialized within. George Clinton is a popular reference with respect to Afrofuturism. I'm sure we have a lot of Funkadelic fans here. But ultimately, even if you get around the imagery itself, the music, the way that the music was actually used to create a sound for the future and to really use language, saying things like what's up is down and so forth, it helped to kind of disorient our sense of reality. And if you look at those lyrics beyond just the sense of, making you want to dance around, if you look at some of those lyrics, the concept of inverting reality puts people in a different space where you can start to look at things a little more critically, or maybe you can connect to yourself a little deeper. Octavia Butler is a common reference in Afrofuturism, and she is particularly exciting because she was an inspiration for many women, because science fiction had issues with representation around women as well. And she often took the perspective of not the conqueror, but the person who was dealing with being at these very odd intersections in life. And how do you make difficult situations work for you? How do you survive? Survival was seen as triumph in many of her works. Alice Coltrane is a personal favorite of mine, but as a composer, she would bridge different musical forms that referenced Eastern wisdom and philosophy, and again, looking to use music as a healing agent. Grace Jones, I'm very excited about, of course, but again, we're talking about looking at images and people who are sort of challenging our notions and our idea around reality, but also our concept, giving us a different sort of vision around what future looks can be. And of course, there's Janelle Monáe, who we're excited about, and she references her android mythology within her stories. So Afrofuturism is not new. The term was created in the early 90s. It was coined by Mark Derry, and it was done so because there was this recognition that there are people of African descent who have always contributed to the ideas of the future and to the concepts around change and innovation, both artistically and philosophically. And of course, people are excited about the upcoming Black Panther project, which is really a testament, I think, to the newfound popularity of Afrofuturism and some of the enthusiasm that we now see online, where many Afrofuturist fans are connecting. So there's a burgeoning world of works where people are now actively using Afrofuturism. There's the Black Quantum Futurism piece. There's Octavia's Brood, which are a collection of science fiction stories which are written by activists. And the point is to help people truly connect with who they are and to want to project and move forward. So there are a couple differences between Afrofuturism and traditional science fiction, which I'll just show to you briefly. One is that there is a nonlinear sense of time where the future, the present, and the past are very much one. You can see that in this image by Kerry James Marshall. It's a depiction of a family using an African aesthetic, but they are in a space station. This image from Rayla 2212, which evokes some of the traditional African mask work, but also images from kind of a cyborg imagery from the future as well. There is a relationship between mysticism and technology, and there's a valuing of the feminine, the divine feminine concept, which again is looking at the relationship between intuition and the thinking nature. So ultimately, Afrofuturism is it's both an aesthetic, but it's a methodology, and this methodology is one that helps people to really champion their own imaginations. And I encourage people to look at Afrofuturism as a mode in that sense, to really look at what are you buying into as the future? What narratives, what images are you replaying in your mind? And are they coming from within you, or are they being projected upon you? Have you made decisions about agency? Do you feel you can you have input in the future? Do you feel that you can make a difference? And who or what do you associate with that? So ultimately, that's what Afrofuturism champions, and that's why I'm excited about it. Thank you.
Hi everyone, just a second, plugging in my laptop. Yes, there we go. Okay, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be part of this salon. Just a little bit about myself and what I do to get started. I'm originally trained as an architect, but I'm an information designer. So as Paola introduced, I'm not a futurist. I'm a designer who works with data as my material. And in my day job, I run a data visualization firm. It's called Accurate. We are a team of 25 designers and developers split between Italy, Milan, which is my home country, and New York, where we started an office a few years ago. And we work across different industries, helping our clients make sense of information, of data, visually. And regardless what the final output is, I work with data in a very handcrafted way, focusing my research and my practice on new visual languages that to represent data to make it hopefully more humane, more contextual, and more engaging. I sketch a lot with data. It's my way to make sense of numbers without limits imposed by software presets. And it helps me to focus only on their nature, on their very organization, on their deep meaning. But today, of course, I don't want to show you what I do and how I do it, but mostly why I do it and how I think we as visual designers who work with data can make a real difference now that the ways that we relate with information to information are really evolving more rapidly than we realized. And now that we are lucky, I would say that we are past what I like to call peak infographic, and we're actually left with a general audience that really understands much more of what we do in our profession, and a general audience that is ready to welcome a second and more, a second way of a more thoughtful and meaningful visualization of data. Well, a revolution that I'm starting to call data humanism, a new renaissance where we should aim to question the impersonality of a merely technological approach to data, and a revolution that aims to reconnect numbers to what they really stand for, which are always and more our lives. Because the more ubiquitous data becomes, the more we need to experiment on ways to make it contextual, unique, and intimate. And the only example that I want to bring up today to make my point is a personal project called Dear Data, a zero technological, very laborious experiment with data that was for me the big data hangover cure, because I could show you tons of digital programmed application, but lots of the time the most radical experiments are the ones that can spark interesting conversations about what we are going. So Dear Data was a collaboration with the information designer Stephanie Pozovic. We actually met only a few times in our life, but we decided to work together because we found out that we had many personal and work similarities. We're both expats. I'm an Italian living in New York, and Stephanie, she's an American living in London. We're both the same age. We're also both only children, and in general, we really have seemingly lived parallel lives for many other aspects that I'm not bothering you with. But most importantly, we both shared this very handcrafted way of working with data, preferring drawing to coding as our entry point to get to know our numbers. So we decided to challenge ourselves. Is it possible to use data and drawings only to get to know another human being? We tried. And we started a year-long hand-drawn data correspondence across the Atlantic, where every week and for a year, we use our personal data to get to know each other. So personal data around weekly shared mundane topics such as our complaints or the interaction with our partners, the compliments we received or the sound of our surroundings, but 52 pretexts in form of data to investigate and reveal a particular aspect of ourselves and our days. Personal data that we would then manually hand draw on a postcard-sized sheet of paper and send it from New York to London and from London to New York, where the front of the postcard is the data drawing, and the back of the postcard contains the address of the other person, of course, and the legend, so how to interpret our drawings. And eventually the postcard arrived at the other person's address with all of these scuff marks of its journey over the ocean, where the postal service became really the third party, important party to our data correspondence. Well, so during a time when everybody talks about big data and virtual reality, we of course do small data and physical postcards, you know. Well, it doesn't sound very revolutionary, but by removing technology from the equation, we were really forced to extend ourselves as designers. Because on the one hand, we've each been forced to invent 52 different visual languages, since hand drawing with data, of course, leads to design that are incredibly tailored and customized to the data that you're counting and working with. But also removing the computer from the equation triggered us to find different ways to look at all kind of data as excuses, to tell something about ourselves. In fact, we always conceived from the beginning Dear Data as a personal documentary more than a quantified self-project. Because here we didn't only quantify numbers, we've been adding really qualitative details to our data collection. For example, the very first week of Dear Data, we chose a pretty cold and impersonal topic. How many times do we check the time in a week? And the answer is insane, by the way. So here is the front of my card, and you can see that every little symbol represents all of the times I check the time, order per days and per hours chronologically. Nothing really complicated here. But you also can see in the legend how I added anecdotal details about these moments. In fact, the different instances of my symbols indicates why I was checking the time. Was I late? Was I bored? Was I hungry? Did I check it on purpose or just casually glance at the clock? And this is the key part, giving Stephanie an idea of my days through the pretext of my data collection, something that is not possible if you don't actively add meaning to your tracking. So Stephanie and I spent a year collecting our data manually instead of relying on a self-tracking digital application, and we've done it by hand to force us to gather data on that computer cannot gather, or at least not yet. Finding also data in our minds and in the words we use, and not only in our activities, like in week 3, where we tracked the thank yous that we said and we received, or our complaints, or I composed this musical complaint card, borrowing a very literal visual inspiration from the music notation system to show the repetitiveness of my complaints of different types over time, and their pitch, their loudness, to the positioning of my complaints notes. So did I truly need to complain? Explaining to Stephanie how to interpret my protests and being very honest about how grumpy I've been in the true spirit of sharing. But by doing it manually, we also figured that we could find data beyond the daily tracking of activities and make a survey of what we own, for example. Walk into our closets with the eyes of the data collector, looking for data in the way we categorize and classify our garments. Or exploring if we can use data to become better human beings, at least for a week, and performing acts to be able to then report them, like this week where we purposely smiled at stranger for one whole week and track their reaction. But besides the topic we chose every week, most importantly, we've been adding contextual details to our logs and thus making them truly, truly personal about us and us alone. Because data is the tool that first filters reality in a highly subjective way, and data has this unique power to abstract the world, and it can really help us understand it according to different relevant factors every time. So Dear Data was a personal project that leads to many exhibitions and eventually to a book that has been released in September. And I'm very happy to announce today that it has found the most exciting home here as part of the permanent collection of MoMA, which we could be, thank you, happier and prouder about, and thank you, Paola. But beside my immense personal joy, and to my point for today, Dear Data was a personal project that has been so well received, incredibly well received. We've seen hundreds and hundreds of postcards made by people who learned about the project and wanted to experiment on themselves. And also, even teachers of any grade are using this format to teach their students the world of data. It has opened the idea of data to a wider audience and made it more approachable, more understandable, and more easily relatable to their daily lives. Which isn't the ultimate goal of what we do here as people who work with data, as myself, to try hard to speak as much as possible beyond the room of experts. Well, this is why I believe we have to reclaim a personal approach to how data, all kind of data, is captured, analyzed, and displayed, really proving that subjectivity and context can play a big role in any story with data when we want our audience to truly engage, to truly relate. Because if you think about it, even when we work with big data, the whole point is making this data smaller, more understandable, more meaningful to everyone's lives. So I believe this is the direction we need to go, but how we can achieve it. So to conclude from my experience and to tie this back to the personal project that I've shown back to every other situation with data, I believe we can do it first of all by embracing complexity with data and thinking about data visualization as a tool to render the complexity of the world as opposed to simplifying it. We do it by not relying on standard tools to visualize our data, but by producing visuals that are very specific and tailored to the data that we're working with. We do it by taking into consideration at every stage of every project what data really stand for, what numbers represent in their context. And I could elaborate on this concept forever, but I'm already running out of time. Well, then we do it, of course, by making sure that the data we analyze don't live in a vacuum, but we're carefully woven into their context. And I think that finally we do it by remembering that data is imperfect because it's primarily human-made. And well, if it comes from a sensor, well, a human designed and built that sensor. Data-driven doesn't mean unmistakably true. It never did and probably never will. I still don't have a 10-word definition of what I call data humanism, but I'm dreaming of a world where data is really for everybody and unique to everyone. A data land where talking about data will mean talking about its intimate qualities, and in conversation that will be shaped around subjective, imperfect, and even serendipitous aspects, where data convention are replaced by data possibilities, where data-driven design is maybe replaced by design-driven data, and where ultimately, instead of using data to become more efficient, we will all use data to hopefully become more humane. Well, I believe it's a compelling future to build. Thank you.
Great. So it's ironic that I'm the last one and I have to go quickly, and you'll see why in a second, given what my topic is. You've read the bios. My name is Ari Wallach. I'm adjunct professor at Columbia University, mostly teaching on the future of governance, public policy, and AI. My company, Synthesis Corp, we're here in New York, Washington, Geneva, and mostly now we're working with international NGOs, large foundations, and organizations on helping them kind of think about the long term. And so what I want to go over quickly, so I don't keep getting the fingers, the countdown, is what it is that we do and why it's slightly different. And it's great, because this has been an amazing series of conversations that we've heard, and looking forward to being in the conversation with you all tonight. But it's my firm belief as a futurist, if you will, that the most important thing we can do right now is solve major wicked problems in a way that gets our species in a thriving manner to the 22nd century. That is my only goal whenever we take on new clients. If they don't measure up against that metric, we don't work with them. It doesn't always mean we take on, save the earth types. We work with big corporations, but in that first meeting or that first dinner, if they're not willing to go the distance and work on that very issue, we don't work with them. So what is the problem we want to solve for? Now you'll see why it's ironic, right? Short-termism. So the issue is, from where I sit, if we're going to tackle these major wicked problems, we have to solve for this issue a priori of every other, if we're working on the 17 SDG goals at the UN, which we are, if we don't solve for this, we won't go any further. I met, when I used to meet with CEOs when I first started this 20 years ago, I said, how far out do you want to go? And they were like, I don't know, let's talk 15, 20 years out. I met with a CEO in July, and I said, how far out do you want to go? And he said, 6 months? And I was like, well, you mean for the contract? He goes, no, like thinking. I'm willing to go out 6 months. And so here's the issue. Here's what short-termism does. Short-termism doesn't let the CEO invest in expensive safety equipment, so we get the Deepwater Horizon. Short-termism doesn't let teachers spend quality one-on-one time with their students. So every 26 seconds, someone drops out of high school in America. Short-termism doesn't let Congress pass a deep, true infrastructure bill, so we get the collapse of the I-35 bridge over the Mississippi and 13 are killed. It wasn't always this way, right? We did the Panama Canal. We pretty much have eradicated global polio. We built the Transcontinental Railroad. This was all, the Marshall Plan. And we did women's suffrage. We've done this. We know how to do this. We know how to think and act long, but we've lost it. And so what ends up happening is we persecute people who are trying to flee to a safer place. We sign bills where we take low-level drug offenders and we put them away for life, and we build McMansions without thinking about how people are going to get from them to their work. So what this is what we call the sandbag strategy. So more often than not, what will end up happening is we know the river rises every season, but instead of actually working on the levees, we just put sandbags in place. And so this sandbag strategy becomes endemic to all of the policy, to all the issues that we're trying to tackle. Now, here's the thing. We've come up with a practice, and it's a practice. It's not it's not this one and done. It's not a strategic off-site planning where you go and you do it with a bunch of like cool post-it notes, right? And then 2 weeks later you totally forget about it because we know where that goes. So long path is a practice that's really made up of 3 different ways of thinking. And it's not just for our corporate or our UN clients. It's something that, and we can go into in the Q&A, that I practice with my 3 kids, right? So it's not this thing that's solely meant for up here. So the first and potentially most important component of long path is transgenerational thinking. So I studied philosophy as an undergrad, and then I was thinking about going to rabbinical school, and I couldn't do it because I didn't want to do brisses and weddings and stuff like that. So, but some of if you don't know what a bris is, that's why you're laughing. And so, if you don't, come ask me that later. And so here's the deal. You look at Plato and Socrates and even Heidegger and Habermas, and what we end up doing is when we think about what it means to live a good and a virtuous life, more often than not, we put it in this unit of measure between birth and death, between our own individual life cycle. Think about the entire self-help section of a bookstore, right? It's all about you and your life. Now, what ends up happening is when we look at these kind of major wicked problems that we're trying to solve for, we stack them all on top of us. But what we do know in this kind of long path practice is that these are going to take a really long time. And by that I mean 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Some of these were also obviously decades in the making. So what long path allows us to do, and what really transgenerational thinking pushes us to do, is to think about working in these problems in a way that goes beyond our own life. And we can talk about that in the Q&A. This is obviously informed by Ernest Becker and the denial of death. The feeling has always been that if we solely think about it within our own life cycle, we will not be able to tackle these. The second is futures thinking. You guys, I mean, I think everyone has pretty much covered this, but I want to put a slightly different spin on it. So when we think about today and we think about the future, it's always this single point that's out there. But that single point, that lens, is more often than not defined by the particular dominant worldview of the time. Right now, that's obviously technology. It wasn't always that way, right? The ancients had their own worldview, and it wasn't technology that informed how they thought about tomorrow. The church obviously had their own way about what tomorrow was, and your way of actually potentially even buying your way into it. Now, luckily for us, scientific revolution and the Renaissance came along and kind of took some of that power back from the high priests. Now, what ended up happening, though, is we ended up giving that to the high priests of Silicon Valley. Now, here's the thing. I love technology. It impacts everything we do. Everything in my home has AI or something. You know, you say anything and something just starts talking to you in my home. It's not, except my kids. They never talk to me. Again, I love technology. The issue, and by the way, I'm not saying we give it to this guy back. Like I don't want to necessarily go in that direction. What I'm advocating for is a much more nuanced, and we just heard this in a couple of the talks, a much more nuanced way of thinking and going from the future as a single point to thinking about futures, which is why more often than not we don't use the term future in our work. We use futures. The idea behind that is twofold. One, to drive agency back into the process, both for the individual, for society, and for civilization. And the second part is, yes, it's tech, but science and faith and art and culture, all these other kind of lenses we need to put back on the table if we want to open the aperture of what's possible. The final thinking modality is telos thinking. So this is where I get into a lot of hot water with people. So I'm an Enlightenment thinker. I'm not in the canon, but like I'm in that headspace where I actually think it's okay to have a meta-narrative of where you want to go. Telos, the Greek word of purpose, right? We've lost that as a species and as a society, and we've actually lost it in the past couple of months, to be more specific. But it's really to what end, right? And the question is, when was the last time you asked yourself that when you were facing a major decision? So whenever we're working, right now one of our main clients is the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. So whenever we're facing a major issue, we work with them here in our offices in New York and Geneva, my pushback is always to what end? Because it's a very dangerous question. Because what ends up happening is people will say something, I'll say, well, push that out further, push that out further, push that out further. And I won't get into refugee policy right now, but really the way we're pushing this, what long path thinking and the practice pushes you to do, is to think about this not in terms of the next 6 months or even 6 years, but thinking out 40, 50 years in a kind of post-Westphalian stance, but then acting on it today and laying the groundwork for that. Now, telos is great, and really kind of in some ways, and this is obviously the Odyssey, Homer's epic, and this is Odysseus. And what Odysseus had as his telos was Ithaca. And my main argument in this way of thinking is that as a species, as a society or civilization, however you want to frame it, we have lost Ithaca. And anytime anyone wants to put that out there, they immediately bat it down, and we can go into postmodernism and everything else in the Q&A. But without a telos, we're not going to move forward, right? And this was Thomas Kuhn. This was the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which a lot of people are nodding and love the book. Super important book, paradigm shift. More important than the term paradigm shift was what he said about how you actually get people to shift, which is unless they have a strong vision, a strong narrative of what they're shifting to, unless the frog sees the next lily pad, they don't jump, we don't shift. And we've stopped as a society putting that out there. Obviously, the high priests of Silicon Valley do that all the time, and I'm not knocking that. But what I am saying is, in other areas, we're so consumed by technological evolution, and then we put those images out there that we've stopped thinking about moral evolution and what does that look like and what does that world look like. Now, we're bombarding you with a lot of stuff tonight. So these are the Long Path Labs megatrends that we use. So Long Path Labs is obviously the subsection of Synthesis Corp where we work with our clients who are willing to think out to the 22nd century. So we use these megatrends. These are decades in the making and going out several decades to help frame the conversation. You'll see science and technology is obviously up there, but it's not the only one, right? So our job is to kind of open that up so that people are exposed to different megatrends when they're thinking about those possible futures. And if you send an email to Amy totally has it with the Dropbox. I'm definitely not that technically sophisticated. I would send you to God knows what, like recipes or something. Send an email to megatrends@longpath.org. What you just saw on the previous slide will come back to you. And I could go on and on and on, but I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, let's go and sit down. Let's go and all sit down. Do you remember your positions that you were given at the beginning? It makes me laugh because everybody here tonight spoke in cautious terms about technology, right? And instead, when I invited James Howard Kunstler, the author and critic and future scholar, to come tonight as part of the audience, he shot back kind of a mean email saying, "What are you doing with all those techno-narcissists?" You should have invited. And he said it's so not true. So I would like to just ask for a moment, Dawn, are you there, Dawn Chan? Could you literally in 3 minutes explain what Afrofuturism is? I just wanted to.
Actually, I was going to ask Ytasha a question related to that. So
yeah, but first tell us just very little bit about Afrofuturism.
Okay. Well, the way I was looking at it this summer in an article for Art Forum's identity issue was that I was looking at the gap between how often Asian people in the West are portrayed in these futuristic settings, the gap between that and how frequently they are excluded from portrayals of the present. And I was sort of contextualizing that in both Hollywood and the world of contemporary visual art. So it definitely posed sort of an interesting contrast to what I find so sort of admirable in a lot of Afrofuturist thinking, where, as you talked about, you kind of get, it's a way for a group of people to create their own agency and, I guess, imagine their own fates.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to point that out because it was among the suggested readings. I'm sure that you read them all. Just in case, I wanted to point out this very interesting divergence between the Afrofuturism and Afrofuturism. Well, since you have the mic, I'm going to let you ask the question.
Okay. Well, I guess my answer had a bit of the question in it. Some of the challenge of what I was seeing in in sort of Asia futuristic thinking, some of the challenges were that Asia futurism seemed to encompass a lot of Western tropes and, I guess, Orientalist modes of thought, techno-Orientalism, and ultimately there's a lot in Afrofuturism that has to do with excluding a group from the present. So I guess my question for you is, how do you see Afrofuturism as, how do you see the movement maintaining its own agency and not becoming co-opted by other modes and other groups?
Well, I mean, I think we're in a society where a lot of things in culture get co-opted. And so that doesn't have to be terrible, but there just has to always be the active balance, right, of people who are creating various narratives and celebrating certain lines of thought because they do help people, you know, outside of just, you know, various commercial interests that might not have anything to do with transformation and a certain kind of evolution. So I think it's just about, you know, accepting that there will be a bit of both, and creating avenues and ways to protect certain kinds of thought processes, ultimately so that everyone can engage in them. One of the big things in Afrofuturism, which I didn't mention, is that it talks about race as a technology, and race being something that was very much created largely to justify the transatlantic slave trade and some of the things that evolved as a result. And so obviously we've been changing a bit of that, but we still have this concept of race sort of being this socialized / biological thing. And so to me, when we talk about other futurisms, whether it's Asian futurism or Afrofuturism, and look at other perspectives on that, it continues to help chip away the sense of separation that we tend to put ourselves in.
We all talked in some ways about agency. And agency that was, we referred to citizens, we referred to agency for whole of society to build a future. But so many of us have very specific audiences, like we don't really interact with a wide audience. Well, maybe Ytasha reaches a wider audience because she uses means that are mediums that are accepted by more people. But I'm wondering, you shared with us the tools, and you are, Amy, exhorting us all to become futurists. How do we bring the idea of agency in the future to a wider audience from a podium like the one that Ari has, or Georgia has, or what do you think?
So my greatest concern for the future is not killer robots, and honest to God, it's not Donald Trump, although he is a terrifying person. My greatest fear for the future is that we have fetishized it. And I didn't talk about this, but there's I sort of was curious and did this study, and the word futurism and our fascination with it, and our fear, and then the sci-fi that results, and then, you know, there's sort of like these steps that happen, and they happen with each instance of transformative technology. And if you go back to the late 1800s, during the sort of last days of night, it happens there. It was the Tesla and Westinghouse and Edison are having this huge fight over patents and alternating current and direct current. At one point, some dude that Edison is friends with decides to start staging these public demonstrations where he kills elephants and is shocking them with all of this power to prove that direct current is terrible, or alternating current is terrible. Anyway, my point is that it's not long after that modern sci-fi is born. And after modern sci-fi is born, you start seeing these big proclamations. And Ladies' Home Journal, one of the things that's in Dropbox for you, are predictions from 100 years ago, right? And anyhow, we cycle through. And what winds up happening is we fetishize, and then the future is here. And maybe it's not what we wanted. And that happens again and again and again. And AI is one of those conversations. Another one is the future of CRISPR and Cas9, which is a gene editing technique, which is not new. But it seems new because of this cycle that we're caught in, where we're routinely surprised and shocked. And then we feel powerless. We feel like we don't have agency at all. And then it becomes normalized within our society and culture, and then we move on to the next thing. And that's my fear. My fear is that we're not going to break free of this cycle. And the challenge is that technology is part of every single thing that we do. And it is more and more sophisticated and more complicated. And that's why I am so desperate to have everybody start making the future more boring. I'd like for you to be more bored, which is not to say to remove the creative process, but I would like for us all to stop being so surprised. Because the moment that we stop being surprised, and the moment that we are aware of what's happening, the moment at that point we can participate. And once we are participating, then we are all, in a situation where we can create better futures for ourselves.
Ari, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, look, the work we do at Columbia and with different governments and in refugee camps is all about, to Amy's point, is all about participation and participatory. A lot of what we do is participatory democracy, but it's really participatory futures, right? And the idea that the future is this thing that's out there that others are in control of, which is this issue that I have with kind of techno-utopianism or techno-fetishization, where it's something like, I don't understand, so it's out there, so somebody's doing it. We try to pull that back and actually involve people. So one of the professors that I teach with at Columbia, she does a lot of work in Brazil on participatory budgeting, right? Which seems very boring and mundane and not very techno-centric. But it's really like you actually control the future in your own decisions that you make at the very kind of micro level of where do you want the town to put money towards this park or towards a new firehouse? And to Amy's point, it's boring, but that's it. That's where we have to go and bring people into that. And it's very much like the Burning Man ethos, right? Don't observe, participate. And we've moved into a very kind of observational culture, and bringing people back into a participatory one doesn't mean they necessarily have to participate in something that's way out there in the year, a 2030 type project. It can literally be in something in that week's work at the very kind of local democratic level.
Mm-hmm. And Georgia, in a way, you're trying to bring data to a much more intimate level. Data humanism is also about the kind of a slow data. You were talking about small, but it's almost slow data, like slow food. And data has been hailed as the basis for so much forecasting and short-term or medium-term thinking. So how do you transform this intimate approach to data into actual agency about the future?
Well, I think that most of all, what also has been really striking for me with the resonance that Dear Data has had is, and I'm really just seconding you about the idea that we are almost in an observatory mode all the time, is the idea that makes people willing to be more active with their data. Because normally what you do is passively applications and whatever kind of digital application collects data from you. And there's this thing that we expect an app to tell something revelatory about ourselves, just by, kind of counting all of these things about you, and then you look at the chart and you learn something about yourself. But that's absolutely not true. And I really believe that we have to engage, every one of us really have to engage in sense making about data according to anyone's personal stories and personal context. And so the more we realize that data is actually a material that we can use to get to new knowledge and to get to new, also engaging parts of our life, as opposed to the ultimate and definitive answers to all of our questions. I think the more we will have agencies in understanding the data is the beginning of a conversation. And sometimes I think that we've always tried to use data as a blunt end of the conversation. These are facts, these are data, we are done. But we are not there yet. Data is really not there yet, because what you decide to collect or left over to a data set really informs the course of its life. So that's, kind of articulated answer to your question.
What did you call it? Peak information?
Peak infographics.
Oh,
I think
peak
we're
infographics.
after peak
I love that
infographics.
slide.
Yeah, no. I usually call it drunkenness. So peak infographics is a little bit,
It's
I don't know.
more
It's
elegant.
true. When there's a new technology, there's this drunkenness, and then you sober up and things start getting more elegant and respectful and better made.
Just to adapt to that, I mean, if I would had more time, I would have elaborated on that. But I believe that we're after this peak infographic because, so far, visual design has a lot being used only as a cosmetic retouch to problems, data problems to make them look better. But on the other hand, we've been always throw technology at the problem and produce this kind of minority report dashboard. So, I mean, and that's not so bad because again, people are now more, we are all more comfortable with data, with what data means, with the language that have been used to represent data, even if sometimes they have been misleading. So I believe it's a really good place to be, and the revolution with data and with big data, to me, still have to start.
Ytasha, it's interesting to see how science fiction, after a moment in which it was either dystopian or utopian, that's it was kind of binary, has become this arena for real world fighting and real struggle. I'm talking, for instance, of the phenomenon of sad puppies that you might want to explain to the audience if they don't know. Maybe because it's become more nuanced, not only nuanced in terms of cultural and ethnic background, but also nuanced in terms of the relationship with the past, you know, this idea of diachronic fiction. It's become really incredibly political, as you were explaining before. So sad puppies, maybe you want to say better what it is, because it's...
You can go into the sad puppies or whoever's more...
No, go ahead.
No, I'm not the best person to talk about sad puppies.
Oh, okay. No, but no, it's something that we don't like. Well, basically what I found out, and I didn't know it at all, that there's an alt-Republican wing to science fiction too. So there's a science fiction prize that happens every year that is kind of
And
by
they
popular
don't
vote.
like it when women are up for those awards.
Yeah, women or people of color. It's like they want to have white males in science fiction as protagonists of science fiction, and therefore they kind of do this denial of service attacks and pull up certain titles as opposed to others. But, right, did I describe it correctly? So it's very interesting because usually in the past, science fiction didn't used to be a political arena, and instead it's become really so.
Well, I think that's in part because of, it sort of proves the point that Afrofuturism brings up just simply by having the term Afrofuturism, that there's an idea of what the future looks like and who participates in that. There's an idea of what the norm is. And when Afrofuturism shifts that, not just in terms of representation of people of color, but also in terms of certain thought processes. I mean, the whole idea of bridging mysticism and technology in a science fiction novel, for some hardcore sci-fi people, you know, they would say that that's not acceptable. To talk about women's issues, you know, or to have a host of characters who are women and to really engage in this idea of the divine feminine, or you're looking at intuition, or you know, you're talking about emotions and feelings as guidance narratives in the course of science fiction. I mean, for some, it forces certain kinds of readers to think about things they don't ordinarily think about. And so it's not comfortable. And you would say, oh, well, that's what science fiction is for, to make you think about things that you're not comfortable with, except for there has consistently been a certain kind of narrative that has been presented. That it's on one level, like I said, it's representation, but the other are ideas that come from other places. And sometimes it's just the concept that these ideas exist and have always existed that makes some people feel really, really uncomfortable.
And the truth is that the moment you start exposing the world to alternatives that are possible and preferable, the world moves towards them, you know, slowly but surely. So I think that also these kind of people see it as a danger to have that kind of possibility out in the open.
Mm-hmm. I think that, I mean, like so I gave the talk that I ran through in like 3.5 minutes is usually like an hour long. So I gave this to a group of 100 progressive faith leaders a little while ago. And so the conversation was around futures, but and I had given the Long Path talk in Silicon Valley 2 months before then. And it was amazing being in the room with technologists and then with progressive faith leaders in Atlanta a little bit while longer. And their visions and ideas of those narratives were vastly different. It was a very kind of human, non-hegemonic, non-white male future, which is exactly what I had a few months before in the Valley. And I don't want to, and it sounds like I'm being judgmental, it's just, but there's very different narratives at play. And I think the overarching narrative of what the future is actually so constrained right now and so limiting that it's doing a major disservice to society. And so the question is how, and that's why I love like anything that can kind of open that back up, be it from faith or from art, is unbelievably important right now in 2016 if we want to get through what I think is a narrowing of a possibility that we have right now as a civilization.
But this is important because one of the reasons why so many people think we're running towards the sixth extinction is because people are not able to see beyond their nose, their own lifetime, and maybe their children's lifetime. So bringing it to the level of a community, of a group's interest is a way to go. Which other ways do you use, which other means and tricks do you use to get your CEOs or your NGOs or your UNHCR commissioners, well, that's his job, I think, beyond high commissioners. Sorry, I forgot an H. Sometimes I always become, acronyms. So how do you get people to think so long term if they don't have it in them already?
Like there's tactics and strategies, but a lot of when we talk about transgenerational thinking, it's actually a relief to a lot of people to know they don't have to fully solve something in their own lifetime, right? There's this kind of heavy existential angst about legacy and who am I and why am I here, and when we kind of bring that up and change the question from who am I and why am I here to who are we and why are we here, we find that opens up what they're able to think about. There's this great story, and I'll do the 30-second version from the Talmud about this guy, Honi, the wise man, who's walking down a road and he sees an old man like in his 80s planting a carob tree. And he says to him, Honi says, why are you planting this carob tree? How long until it bears fruit? And he said, at least 30 or 40 years. And he says, well, you won't be around for this. And he goes, that's true, but when I was a young boy and a young man, there were many carob trees for me to take fruit from. Those were planted by my parents and by my grandparents. And so through stories like that, but the longer version and those kind of conversations, it allows leaders to see their role isn't, yes, they can solve, and they need to solve certain acute issues, but allows them to kind of expand what is possible and see it less as a sprint from like the start to a 100-meter dash, and much more as a relay, and recognizing their job is to be in that transition zone and hand the baton off and set the next runner up. And when we have that conversation, that allows them to see a range of possibilities that take them out of the short term, what's right in front of them.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the, just as humans, again, we are continually faced with this paradox of the present. And if we had a car company that wanted us to figure out not what's the future of cars, but what is the future of driving, right? Given what we know to be true in the year 2016. And the challenge is that you have to allow yourself a certain amount of chromatic ambidextry, which is to say that you have to be thinking about today, like that CEO, in order to be responsible to his shareholders and the people who work for him, has to think about risk, right? And risk is what we manage in the present and the near future, but you also have to think about where are we going? And it's that where are we going piece that's so challenging. So the very first part of our methodology, something you could all do, it's called a fringe sketch, something everybody should do. And that is that as you are thinking about the future of something, you sort of start, we have a set of guiding questions, but you start drawing circles and connecting the circles that sort of look like they should be connected together. And the goal with that is to not think about what's in your present circumstance, but to think much further out. So for example, if I was thinking about what's the future of driving, I would be looking at, the future. I mean, honestly, part of that would include the future of things like biomaterials, because maybe tires won't need to carry the same amount of weight because cars won't have the same amount of components. Therefore, I would look to places like the MIT Media Lab and to Neri, who's probably designing some kind of crazy new, biomolecular material that then changes X, Y, and Z. So the point is to really broaden the scope, but it's difficult to do that. It's difficult when you're confronted with day-to-day challenges to think about today, to think about a few years from now, and a few years after that, but you have to allow yourself to do all of those things, which again, we have different kinds of futures as a way to sort of plan through that. And this is the other important thing. Everybody wants the answer. And there is no answer. And that's a difficult pill to swallow, especially if you're an undersecretary of state, who we talk to, all, right? And if you're a CEO. You have to be comfortable with ambiguity. And so rather than seeking out the answer, you need to seek out the path and be willing to adjust that path as you go along. And that's something that we are, especially as Americans, we like having the answer. We think we know the answer. And it's challenging for us to think in this different way, but it's essential. It's essential.
Questions from you? Yeah. Okay, Susan, she raised her hand before. So one here.
Wait for the microphone?
Yeah, it's coming.
Mm-hmm. Thank you all. It was amazing. One quick thought and then one question. I think to think boring, you need to have good stories that aren't boring. We've got too many competing Jetson narratives. And I think the Afrofuturism narrative and Georgia's narratives are powerful as well. But the real thing that struck me was the short-termism. And you started to allude to how do you contend with short-termism. I would ask you to critique this proposition. I feel short-termism is endemic because we don't know history. And history has become completely unfashionable. Now, history doesn't have to be taught as chronological. It could be modes of thought that cycle through time. But if you don't have any sense of history, there's only the present. So I would be curious to hear you react to that.
I can't critique it because I agree with you 100%. I mean, like, and you said the second part that I was going to say was it's not just because our history is always like the history of the conqueror, right? So there's and it's always usually male. Like, so part of it is the facts of history, but it's historic. There's a great. It was actually a book / PDF. It's kind of like I think it was called Manifesto of the History or Historian Manifesto about how to think historically and its impact and its role. And so I agree with you 100%. We completely, and I could give you a bunch of facts about how little Americans know about history or let alone where Canada is on a map, let's say. So geography, but 100% without that sense of history. And this is what my friend Doug Rushkoff writes about this in Present Shock, right? If you lose the past, you lose the future. And we've so lost the path that we're stuck in this presentist moment. And there's a bunch of other reasons around that. But without that history, there's no way you're going to move forward.
Okay, please. By the way, I didn't ask Susan to introduce herself. That was Susan Yanovich. Can you please introduce yourself also?
Sure. My name is Sankalp Bhatnagar. I'm a student at Parsons, the New School for Design. And so there's been a lot of talk tonight about how we future and how we envision the future and how we might sort of need to push ourselves to envision alternatives. And I'm wondering, what would be your recommendation for strategies for how the public might begin to challenge existing visions from corporations, from sci-fi, et cetera, so that we can begin to press possibility into existence?
Ytasha, would you like to take that answer? It's not your comfort zone, but it might be interesting for that reason.
Right. Well, actually, I guess in some ways it might be because I like the use of the imagination. To me, that's what inspires action. So if you're thinking about a world you want to live in and you contemplate, you start slowly thinking about what that looks like, then, moment by moment, you can peel away any kind of sense of limitation that you have in the present. So when I was working with a group of kids, they were, I believe, 5th graders, and they were kind of in a troubled neighborhood, and I wanted them to talk about the future, and they kept talking about violence. I don't want to see any violence. I don't want to see the violence. I don't want to see the violence. And pretty much every kid in the class was saying that. And I was expecting them to talk about spaceships and going to Mars and, all sorts of shiny tech things. And at some point, I had to get to, okay, well, you're telling me what you don't want to see. Tell me what you do want to see. It's not as if that's the only thing you've seen your whole life. So what does that look like? And slowly they were able to talk about what a world without violence looks like. And they said, we can go out and play outside all day, and we can do this, and we can do that. And then slowly it was, okay, well, what does that feel like? And then they started talking about what it felt like, because they felt, a sense of peace, throughout their life in various ways. So, and after you go through all that, then you could get into, they were talking about certain technologies or things they were curious about, or music. And at some point, one girl raised her hand and she said, so you're saying we can change the future? but it took almost, an hour and a half, and these are kids. But I guess my point is that if you contemplate things that you would like to see, and stop thinking about what you don't want to see, but what you would like to see, and then slowly, almost work backwards. Or think about, okay, well, what step could I take today, or what does it feel like to have that experience, and see if you can create a way to experience that in the present. And I think that'll spark other ideas.
And if I can add up to that very quickly, I really agree. And I think that all your point is also to try to reframe the questions. And I work with data. It's a very, very specific field, but I am a designer, and so I always kind of have a design approach. And I always hear that design is solving problems, but I feel that baking a design process from the very beginning into any kind of problem actually is helping framing the right questions. So for example, with my clients, even though we work with corporation, big banks, we always really, really try to use design from the very beginning, and a designer's approach that really can help you reframing the question. And I would also say that maybe what I would do is trying to get to uncomfortable path. So something that is probably you will make a mistake, but it's something that is worth exploring. And so reframing questions. And if you feel that something is uncomfortable but can be explored, I will definitely go this way.
The easiest way to get out of the paradox of the present is to force yourself to explore things that you've never seen before. There is a reason. So you mentioned the Jetsons and flying cars. There has literally been a handful of flying car models every single decade consistently since 1919. There are brand new flying car models today, a day in which we know that self-driving cars are just around the corner. Why are we still trying to design cars that can fly? The reason is because we have these cultural references. We should be spending, everybody should be spending time in places like MoMA, and they should be spending time in nature, right? And getting outside of what we know, to be true from our own vantage point. And in doing that, we start to eliminate some of that belief bias in the paradox of the present, and we are able to unlock these other avenues for us to start thinking.
I was going to say, while you're getting the next part, there's a thing out of Arizona State University called the Hieroglyph Project. So much of what we think about what is going to be coming tomorrow comes from science fiction that hasn't, tropes that haven't changed. So what the Hieroglyph Project did was they commissioned a lot of different artists and thinkers to think about and literally write new short science fiction stories, but in many ways had more of a kind of human center to them. And the idea being, so instead of thinking about what's the next flying car, the next tricorder, or the next top-down version, what does a bottom-up futures look like? And that was just through sci-fi. So, to your question about we're working with a consortium of social justice organizations right now. First thing we did was we asked them, write us headlines from the New York Times in 2030, but with you at the center of it, your organization at the center of it. What did you do? And it's not about did you win or not, but through that conversation and driving kind of new narratives of and the interesting thing is a lot of people we had in the room were people who would no longer be at those organizations for various, where they were the EDs, and we were pushing them out. And by pushing kind of new stories, we were able to, one, as already said, start thinking about how to reverse engineer into that, even though there's a meandering path to that. But two, it was kind of a critical theory-based approach to modeling out different scenarios for them, but that they owned, as opposed to saying, these are the parameters that you have to work within. Where do you want to be? But we do that with our corporate clients. We do that with CEOs of Fortune 100 companies, with state and the White House and DOD. We do it. And it sounds like such a simple exercise, but once you start doing that, you open them up and you open the conversation up to kind of more critical questions.
I like that, from children to CEO and Pentagon. I have you, but first there's the lady with the purple coat.
Hi.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
My name is Nancy Knox-Talcott. I have a question, and it sort of integrates what you're all talking about, and that is with the advent of so much more technology. To Amy's point, we shouldn't be as frightened, but there seems to be a passivity that has been encouraged by technology when you're talking about AI and the self-driving cars and things that are done for us. And I see, even in my own stepchildren, a real lack of curiosity and imagination, which is brought about somewhat by having all this information delivered at you, to you, 24/7. And I'm wondering how we reconcile the slow data, which is sort of reintegrating and reintroducing imagination and tactile, sort of hands-on, and the long-term philosophy with all this new information, all this technology. How do we bring the old with the new?
Georgia, do you want to take this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't have a unique answer. What I believe is that we really still have to keep on exploring how to make all of this information that we generate all of the time by just like breathing, all of this information and data that we generate, how to make it more contextual to our lives. So of course the very tactile and small and analog experience that I was showing is just one possible very radical experiment, but in general I think that we as designers, I mean, again, I'm not a futurist, I'm a person that tries to envision futures by making things and by seeing how they are received, is by keeping on exploring how to make this cold and impersonal field of data very personal and very meaningful to one's life. So find a way to reconnect it to one's personal experience. And then I think that starts the moment when people would understand that it's up to them to really make sense of all of the things that they are generating. And again, that they don't have to expect any kind of like web application software to really reveal something super interesting about themselves without an active act of sense making about that. And I just ultimately believe that technology has done an amazing job so far, but now again we are peak and past this peak, and it's really just the moment when all of us needs to just understand that it's up to us ultimately to find ways to make this number more meaningful.
Maria? Also introduce yourself.
Maria Popova. The theme, the name of the salon, Informed Future, strikes me as a little bit of an oxymoron, because information is only based on what's come before, and this question of how we look forward to the future and sculpt it together necessitates rising to the levels of meaning and wisdom which require a leap of imagination beyond information. And I was thinking about James Baldwin and him saying that you have to tell the world how to treat you, and if the world tells you how you're going to be treated, you're in trouble. And today, we've outsourced so much of ourselves to the data about us, the information about us, and that's shaping how we come to perceive ourselves or how we're kind of portrayed outwardly. And so almost as if we've surrendered meaning to the statisticians and not the seers like Baldwin and the people who are able to make these leaps. So I guess I would love to know how you think about creating a culture that reclaims some of that from the realm of the statisticians and cultivates room for seers.
Well, I guess, from my point of view, it's the convergence of the two. So in the model, every futurist uses a different model. And in my model, up until about 3 years ago, it had 5 steps. And then I started picking it apart and trying to figure out, this is something that I've been doing for 11 years. And when I took a step back, I realized that I had somewhat inadvertently modeled, so sort of in a meta model way, I was using the Stanford D School's flare and focus model without sort of realizing that that's what was happening. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the D School has a philosophy of you have to sort of flare to get big ideas and to think broadly, but at some point you have to focus and narrow down. And to your point, the company that fascinates me most right now is Magic Leap. And it is precisely because they are seers and they are statisticians.
It's because nobody knows what
they
are.
But some people know.
This mystique.
Some people know. So for those of you, the short end of the story is this is a very mysterious company that is in Florida that took over an old Motorola building. But I have read every single one of their patents, and they are fascinating. You should read. You should read their patents. One of my favorite things I ever read was a 350-page patent that alternates between seeing and fact. between sci-fi, fantasy, and data. And they are describing essentially a set of glasses that have cameras in them that allow you to do all kinds of things. Like, we could have my grandmother sitting here, and it would seem as though to me like she's here, and it would seem as though to her that I was sitting in her living room in Chicago, and yet we are here with each other. The technology is one thing, but the point that I'm trying to make is that I think the great thing about the future is that we have not, or at least I have not, relegated it to statisticians. But I also don't think that it's a fantasy, because there are plenty of people out there who do this, who come up with these crazy, fantastical ideas, but act as though those are foregone conclusions. And instead, it's very much the intersection of these two things, which means that people who are exceptional at flaring are just as important as people who are exceptional at focusing. That the seers are just as important, and the creative people and the designers and the artists are just as important in crafting the future as the scientists and the mathematicians. It's really the convergence of these two. Yeah.
Yeah, and it occurs to me that talking also about companies and big companies, one of the company that I believe is doing a really great job right now is IBM. So right now, maybe you all know that IBM is the biggest design company in the world. So they really revolutionated the way they work by hiring 500,000 designers in the, no, I'm sorry, yeah, 500?
1,000.
No, yeah, 1,500. I'm sorry, 1,500. Well, it would be great, but 1,500 is a great number.
Okay,
Anyway, no, 1,500 designers in the last 2 years, and really completely changing the way they work. And I believe that, again, to your point, that's very true, because IBM is, of course, a very technology-based company, but now they're trying to shape a different future for the company and for their customers by this kind of hybridization, and I believe they're really doing a great job.
And those designers are working alongside the IBM Watson team,
Yeah.
and I can tell you something that is not, I guess it's public-ish. We're being live streamed.
Yeah.
It's probably okay. So they have built something called Debater. And Debater takes a corpus, which is another sort of fancy way of saying a bunch of data. And from that corpus, you can ask it a question, and it will give you all of the pros and all of the cons. Okay, so it will go through, synthesize, analyze all the information, and just as though you had sort of an oracle or somebody, some kind of helper.
It's like a paparatron.
Kind of. Now, here is the interesting thing. So Debater right now uses Wikipedia as its corpus, and so nobody should trust Wikipedia, but if you ask it a question about gun violence in video games, it will give you the pros and the cons. Another thing that it will do is it will fact check in real time.
Nice.
And just like I was a high school and college competitive debater, so if any of you were like me, you'll know the significance of this. It can suss out who the opponent is, fact check in real time, and then think several steps ahead, and tactically have an argument, a debate with that person, knowing what that person is probably going to say. And guess who it's been tested against? Not me. No, that would have been awesome. No, but it rhymes with Schmalner Schrump. That was a... There you go. Okay, so obviously it wasn't ready in time. It rhymes with grump. Dump.
Dump.
So, that sort of thing would not have been possible with just computer scientists sitting in a lab. Yeah. That future that we are headed towards requires people like you and people like you, right? It requires these, seers and great thinkers and designers and people who think about, faith and religion and culture. And that's the beautiful thing about what they're building, yeah.
And just to conclude about IBM, Phil Gilbert, the head of designer, made the company uncomfortable, made all of the developers and the technologists uncomfortable by really, putting designers working side by side with them. And it was kind of like a bold choice, but I believe it's really great.
So I have to apologize, Philip, but you can continue afterwards. I have to close, unfortunately. But first of all, I would like to also thank Xaviera Cubara, who's the new R&D research assistant. She just started, so she also helped put together this PowerPoint and this night and all of my team. And I would like to thank you because you've been so absolutely awesome, and also you in the audience. And we're going to go outside and we can keep on drinking and we can keep on not talking about what's going to happen tomorrow. And I really am so happy that we reprised this this habit of the salon. So until the next one, thank you so very much.